Don says in question 13, I am going to ask some questions now that may be a little off-center of what we are trying to do. I'm not sure because I'm trying to, with these questions, unscramble something that I consider to be very basic to what we're doing. Please forgive my lack of ability in questioning since this is a difficult concept for me. Could you give me an idea of the length of the first and second density that occurred for this planet Earth? Ross says, there is no method of estimation of the time-space before timelessness gave way in your first density. To the beginnings of your time, the measurement would be vast. To the beginnings of your time, the measurement would be vast. And yet, this vastness is meaningless. Upon the entry into the constructed space-time, your first density spanned a bridge of space-time and time-space of perhaps 2 billion of your years. So, we're talking about the evolution of the planet itself, which is evolution of mind, body, spirit. And we have to start obviously with first density. I think Don's question was about the length of time in first and second, right? And we do get an answer in here, but first, let's get into context. So here's where I'll start giving both perspectives. You know, the scientific perspective of, and I'm going to call it scientific because it's a method of studying by segmenting, dissecting. And then there is the method of study from oneness, from consciousness, the scientific method in consciousness, the science of consciousness. So what's happening here? We're coming out of timelessness, right? Because before there is anything, there is nothingness or no thingness. There cannot be something objective before we have objectivity. Okay? So let's study it from the scientific perspective, physical, metaphysical, and then from consciousness. From the scientific perspective, we see what was before the Big Bang. You see? Now the Big Bang is something that's happening to you every morning, but you don't know it. You perceive it as just waking up. It's the same thing. When we get into consciousness, we're going to see it that way. But again, Big Bang happens. It comes from nothingness. There is no time because there are no events happening to be able to measure time. So you see, that which is prior to things, to time, to space, must be timeless. And of course, objective-less. So that's why Ra says, there is no method of estimation of the time-space before timelessness gave way in your first density. Now, in the cosmology, we know that first density comes from timelessness, and then it goes into this movement, which is the vibration that creates first density. And then so on, but I won't get ahead of myself. To the beginnings of your time, the measurement would be vast, and yet this vastness is meaningless. What is the distance between the event horizon and the singularity? There is no distance, you see. There is just one, no time, no object, no nothing. That is the black hole. And from this black hole is that everything comes out. Now, you are that black hole. The atoms are black holes. Everything is, really. But before I keep getting too abstract, the only thing that matters is that scientifically we know that everything came out of nothing. And that is a big puzzle for people who study. And they say, well, that's just creepy. We don't get into that. Upon the entry into the constructed space-time, your first density spanned a bridge of space-time and time-space of perhaps 2 billion of your years. Now, what is the constructed space-time? Upon the entry into the constructed space-time, this is what Ra calls the first, it's that there's sort of like a threshold between timelessness and the beginnings of movement, right? It's an arbitrary distinction from our point of view because we cannot see anything that cannot be measured. And yet that experience exists. We all live it. I'm talking about the experience of nothingness. That is consciousness, pure consciousness. So that's happening. That's the beginning of movement. There is an activity. There is free will focused on light. Free will, love, light. That is the focus, right? And now from that moment in which attention, we can call it attention, from consciousness, we're going to see it this way. Attention becomes a thing. Then at that point, there is the process of creating first density. And that is 2 billion years of attention, of focusing. Yes? Beautifully. We can see it even with the 3 distortions, the primal distortions of the law of one. Free will, then there is focus and light being created. That light, as it's being created or morphed into the imagination of the logos, then it goes into a process of 2 billion of years, of our years, here on planet Earth at least. We're not talking about another planet. It could happen on other planets, but I think we should stick with planet Earth. Now, from consciousness, how does this look? Well, what is timelessness? If you ask the question, who am I? You can navigate it all the way down or up to, or whatever, whatever direction you want to call it, all the way to the experience of no thoughts, no mind. Consciousness precedes thoughts. Consciousness is the container of experience. So you can see that there is timelessness there. There are no events happening, so there is no way to measure time. There are no limits. It's infinite. It's infinity. There are no limitations. There is no quality, although quality is a word that I use to express the innate feeling of consciousness. But there are no distinct qualities, you see. There's just what it is and what we can experience, or as I call it, imperience. So that's timelessness. Now, what happens when we wake up? Well, we're waking up to all 3 densities right here, at least when we wake up to space-time 3D reality. If you pay attention, you can see that and this is a very subtle distinction, of course, but you are made up of these first and second densities. The you, consciousness, wakes up to first, second, and third density. And you can measure this. You can see it in your own body, in your own human experience. And then there is the exploration of love and all that, which is 4th density and so on. So I won't get into that because we're only going into first and second density here, right? But that is the perception of consciousness. From the perception of consciousness, you can see that this is happening all the time. It's not something that is reserved for the future. It's here, it's now, it's only awaiting our exploration. And you can see why when we go into the exploration of the creation, we see all these things. First, second, third, fourth, love, 5th, communication, wisdom, 6th, unity, sacramental nature of all things. 7th density is the gateway back to yourself. It's a cycle. And what is 7th density? The same as 1st density if you are using consciousness, because what happens? You go back to singularity. Singularity is just going back to meditation, into nothingness. Meditation into nothingness, or awareness. The awareness of being aware. That is the recipe, if you want to use it, if you can call it that. All right, so let's move on with what Ross says. They say 2nd density is more easily estimated and represents your longest density in terms of the span of space-time. We may estimate that time as approximately 4.6 billion years. These approximations are exceedingly rough due to the somewhat uneven development which is characteristic of creations which are built upon the foundation stone of free will. Free will, welcome here. So second density is easier to estimate in terms of time because time already exists. Prior to second density, there is matter, there is energy, intelligent energy moving in patterns, let's put it that way, to maintain ourselves within law of one cosmology. So intelligent energy is already dancing, let's put it that way. There is an imagination happening in the mind of the logos. And so second density follows the patterns of first density, but now in terms of movement and growth, these are the two characteristics of second density, according to Ra. So that was around 4.6 billion years. That was, we had a planet of, what was it, 2 billion years, they said, right? 2 billion years, right? And then 4.6 billion years. It's interesting. What is the age of the Earth? Isn't it 5 billion? Let's look it up. How old is Earth? No, that's not the question. How old is Earth? I think it's around, oh my god, 1,000, there we go, 4.5 billion years. Well, I can't add those two and have consistency with science, but it's that would be 6, unless Ra, no, that can't be. All right, well, who do we trust, science or Ra? It's up to you. But 4.6 billion years is the time that it takes for second density, right? We may estimate that time as approximately 4.6 billion years. These approximations are exceedingly rough due to the somewhat uneven development, which is characteristic of creations, which are built upon the foundation of stone of free will. I don't know why the estimations are rough. In terms, I'm only thinking about second density, how it evolves, because from first density. So maybe it's taken into account first density. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe our measurements are off, thinking that it's 4.5 billion years that the Earth has been here. Perhaps before the planet actually coalesced, there was a time that Ra's adding into the account here. I don't know. I really don't know. But that's irrelevant. The point is that second density takes a long time. The cycle of first density is 2 billion. The cycle of second density is 4.6 billion. But yeah, no, there's an itch in my mind thinking about. I think the way I can feel good with myself is that first density, what we know about Earth is 4.5 billion years, but before Earth formed. So maybe this is, I think the 4.5 billion, to be honest, has to do with Earth formed as it is, right? As a planet. First density, you know, there is the, which I think is still pretty solid hypothesis, that there is the solar disk, right? There is no planets yet, and that's all the mass of the sun, or all the solar mass, right? And then the sun sort of solidifies, if I can even call it that, and then the planets start doing the same, right? Same process. So maybe that's first density, part of that first density, and it takes 2 billion years before it materializes as a solid rock, in our case, right? Or a sphere. So maybe that's first density, and second density starts right at the beginning of what we know of planet Earth, just having all this movement and growth. Very, very primitive at the time. And yet there is still that happening. I don't know when the first organic molecules were discovered or happened. I forget my science and times and all this stuff, but it's I think it's we're pretty accurate with science. I think it's Yeah, if we take into account 2 billion years for first density, the solar disk coalescing into the spheres and all that stuff, then we can say that's first density, because it's coming out of timelessness anyway. So the sun must also be involved. There's a lot of stuff I don't know. I'm just guessing. But in any case, that's 4.6 billion years the second density takes. These approximations are exceedingly rough. I think when they say that these approximations are exceedingly rough, they have to do with the distinction between first density and second density. Because they say that these are characteristic of the foundation stone of free will, which, in my mind, and again, I can imagine this from the point of view of consciousness now, when you're imagining something, right? Think about imagining something. Imagining a story. You first have a glimpse of what's happening, the scenario and all this stuff. This is a very rough analogy, but you're having an imagination, and it takes time for you to, which is not really time, it's happening in your mind rapidly, but at some point your characters start to have a sort of reality to it, right? And so you can imagine free will doing the same here with second density. How are they going to move, or how they actually, it's not even the imagination, it's the play of free will now within the planet. So it's even better, because we don't know how things are going to react. We just let it loose, right? And just evolves out of that. It's random movement, or what seems like random movement.